Morning, everybody. Welcome. Let me do my weekly fiddling with social media. I just have to post this teaching on my own feeds. Okay, we're good to go there. And now Instagram. Okay. Morning, everybody. It's good to be back. It's good to be back teaching this morning from our C3 page. And today's talk I'm going to entitle "What Really Matters: Attention." If you've been following any of the previous teachings, I've also titled them "What Really Matters," primarily because I think that is the question that I'm asking. I'm not here just doling out answers or even saying something like, stick to the old answers. In fact, quite the opposite. That the question itself, what really matters, is the thing that is working on me, I think, working on us collectively, and worth turning toward. So the subtitle today is Attention. What really matters: attention. Or offering our attention, I might add a bit to it. So let me get some details out of the way. First of all, you are joining, if you're joining us live, you're joining C3 West Michigan's inclusive spiritual community for a short teaching, about a half an hour or so, immediately followed by our guest musician, which I'll also post on the C3 page. Definitely check that out. In fact, our commitment as a community to support our local musicians, we're quite serious about. We're happy to do it because most of them are totally out of gigs and work. And now more than ever, we need music, we need art, we need poetry, we need depth. So that will follow this. Another C3 announcement: please, please, please read the newsletter. Sign up for the newsletter at our website, c3westmichigan.org, and read it, because all the good stuff is in there. We're keeping people up to date about what's happening and ways to get involved. And if you need help, or if you want to provide some help for someone in the community, all in the newsletter. And number 3, this will be my third sort of announcement before we get going. And that has to do with our program called Plant Up and Fly Right. It's our carbon offset program. Last year, we did it in the city of Spring Lake, planting trees in partnership with private donors and the city. And we planted 47 trees. And we're doing that program again for Earth Day, this time focusing on the city of Grand Rapids. Again, it's a private-public partnership. Please buy a tree. I bought one last year. They cost $85. A donor steps up and covers the other amount, plus the city gets involved. This is an unbelievable opportunity for us to think larger than this present moment by thinking in the present moment. What can I do right now? Yes, you can plant a tree. So it's also amazing to be involved in something that will outlive any of us just right now in the strange time that we're in. So again, Plant Up, Fly Right tree program. Sign up for our newsletter at C3. Stay connected with one another through social media, through phone calls, stuff other people have been saying. So that's, I think, just a bit by way of introduction this morning. So I think everything, and I'd like to get going. I want to start in a very unusual place. I want to start with a few thoughts on World War II. And in the most general sense, I want to bring us, by the end of this teaching back to the present moment. What is actually happening right now, and to offer our attention to the present. But I want to start with World War II, primarily because I guess I'm a historian. I do look back just in terms of the wisdom tradition. What has gone before us? What have we survived? What wisdom traditions still feed our understanding of who we are right now? So I want to start with a few thoughts on World War II. And thanks, David, by the way, for the book recommendation, the new Jonathan Safran Foer novel. It's not a novel, it's a work of nonfiction. And what I'm about to read to you comes from his latest book. And I actually can't, maybe I can look it up real quick. Because if I pick up my phone, it will pause Instagram. So give me one second. Let me just look up the name of his new book. It is, thank you, Google, We Are the Weather. It's a book about climate change, and also a book that's more than, I guess it's more than a book about climate change, which any book about climate change is more than about a book about climate change. So anyway, I want to start with a speech given by Roosevelt in 1942. Just listen to what he has to say. This is the President of the United States speaking to a country at war. Not all of us have the privilege of fighting our enemies in distant parts of the world. Not all of us can have the privilege of working in munitions factories or shipyards or farms, or oil fields, or mines, producing the weapons or the raw materials that are needed by our armed forces. But there is one front and one battle that everyone in the United States, every man, woman, and child, is in action and will be privileged to remain in action throughout this war. That front is right here at home in our daily lives and in our daily tasks. Here at home, everyone will have the privilege of making whatever self-denial is necessary, not only to supply our fighting men, but to keep the economic structure of our country fortified and secure during the war and after the war. This will require, of course, the abandonment not only of luxuries, but of many other creature comforts. Every loyal American is aware of his or her individual responsibility. As I told the Congress yesterday, sacrifice is not exactly the proper word with which to describe this program of self-denial. When, at the end of this great struggle, we shall have saved our free way of life, we shall have made no sacrifice. Again, that's from Roosevelt. Addressing the American people during one of the most difficult times in modern American history. Oh. And I heard this speech, and I was moved in a way. I was moved by the President of the United States stepping into a kind of mature form of leadership. I was inspired by such a thing. And I was inspired by what he was asking the American people to think about the war at the time, World War II, as a collective responsibility. And what's amazing about that is that in many respects, World War II was an abstract idea to people. It was a conflict over there, and involving, in many respects, helping out a people group, meaning the Jewish people, of whom are, in a global sense, are a minority, not the majority. In fact, very small part of the European ethnic makeup, and yet Americans said, we are in this anyway, and they did it collectively. And Jonathan Safran Foer offers a list of things in his book, We Are the Weather, that Americans gave up during this time. This, to me, I find mind-blowing, and I didn't know this. First of all, starting with the coasts, people in the United States turned off their lights at dusk. They started with the coast because they were afraid of German U-boats being able to track traffic coming and going from ports. But the entire, even inland cities and towns said, we will join by turning off our lights at dusk. They asked Civil Air Patrol to be on the lookout for German planes, even though it would have been impossible for a German plane to have the fuel and the power to fly from Germany to the United States. They asked average citizens to plant victory gardens, not gardens that were made post-war, but during the war. They increased industrial production by 96%. Hollywood got involved. There were war bonds. Even Julia Child became a spy. They lowered the minimal taxable income, meaning they raised taxes. They reduced they increased the tax base period. And in terms of personal taxable income, I want to get the stats right. It moved for personal federal income tax, from about 10% of the population being involved in a personal federal income tax to 100%. Now, you might say, oh, I lament that, but I'm saying this isn't an effort to combat something that was involving most of the world. They changed the ages and allowed young people to work. The top tax rates for the top taxed earners was raised to 94%. I mean, I can't even imagine such a thing. Imagine the top earners being taxed 94% in a collective effort toward winning the war. They took price controls. They accepted price controls on nylon, coal, firearms, bicycles, and silk. Gas was regulated, and the speed limit, my friends, was lowered to 35 miles an hour. I don't even want to drive 70 miles an hour. I want the freedom to drive faster. But people said, all right, now is not the time. We believe in individual human rights. We believe in basic human rights. We believe in freedom of speech. We believe in freedom of religion, and we're willing to make sacrifices towards some sort of greater whole. Here's an advertisement, which makes me laugh, put out by the government to encourage carpooling. And it said, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Talk about using shame and judgment to force people to carpool. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And of course, food was rationed and farmers stepped up. There was a giant campaign called Share the Meat, where they encouraged the average American to eat only 2.5 pounds of meat per week. Many of us eat more than 2.5 pounds of meat a day. And the final slogan here, it was a common understanding that food will win the war. Now, I'm mentioning all this to remind ourselves that collectively, Americans and maybe we can extend that out in a more global sense, have the capacity for to serve a common goal and common good that far outweighs their individual rights. In fact, in protection of individual rights and basic human rights, people historically have been willing to make enormous sacrifices. And that's what we're being asked in the most simple sense. Make sacrifices. And you just heard the list of things that your ancestors, and in some cases your own parents, sacrificed during World War II. It's amazing. And I don't think people were, it's not like people took great pleasure in it, but they did it because it was the right thing. And we're being asked to sacrifice quite a lot, and some of us more than others, but not compared to what some of our own family members and grandparents and parents did only 70 years ago. So, what's my point? My point is that it's possible for the crisis of our times to expand our consciousness rather than our consciousness shriveling and shrinking and becoming smaller. If you're a part of C3, you've heard me say for a long time that all human consciousness begins egocentric. We don't have another way out of it. It's part of the natural psychological growing up we all have to do. We begin with egocentric consciousness, and pretty soon we expand to ethnocentric consciousness, meaning my tribe, my people group, my religion, my language, my skin color. That's ethnocentric consciousness. Nobody gets out of it, by the way. Let's not fool ourselves that this can be bypassed. Egocentric, ethnocentric, but at a certain point, we are invited, every single human person on the planet, into an even greater consciousness that we can call world-centric consciousness. And that's where we are right now. We're being invited into a much more world-centric consciousness, meaning not just me, meaning not just my family, my tribe, my religion, my church, my skin color, my socioeconomic status, my zip code, but something out as rings in the pond extending out into greater and greater reaches, into a kind of global world-centric awareness. America not only has the capacity to take care of its own, but to think beyond. That's how America got its reputation in the world, to be the kind of country that would have in mind some of the most vulnerable people groups and places on earth. That's actually in our DNA. That's part of our own makeup and our own story. And I think we're being invited into such a place. Look like to sink into a much more world-centric place of consciousness or of awareness. So that's my first point. And my second point has something to do with the question of going back to normal. And first of all, if I can just be honest, I've just about had it, I just read this, inspiring message from Roosevelt and all the sacrifices that Americans were willing to make, and I'm fed up. I don't like the restrictions. I'm tired of it. The novelty has worn off. And the numbers that I see daily increasing of the sick and the dying and the dead, as I see that expanding, I can feel myself almost shrinking in a way. Like the numbers are getting too big, and I find myself at times just with sort of a blank stare. I guess that's a feeling of overwhelmment. And I'm also tired of my lifestyle right now. Like a friend of mine sent me a text message yesterday and said, "Hey, we should hang out on Zoom." I'm like, no, I am zoomed out. That is enough. I don't want any more meetings with little boxes like the Brady Bunch, No, it's fatiguing. And I'm tired of myself checking the weather. Good God. If you live in Michigan, you know what I'm talking about. Like, maybe tomorrow will be nicer. Maybe tomorrow will be nicer. I'm tired of CNN. I'm tired of the daily news briefings. I'm tired of Facebook, and I know I'm on Facebook right now. I'm tired of my Instagram feed. I'm tired. I'm just tired. I'm coming to the limits. And like I said, limits or the impeded stream that has the capacity to sing. And I also know now's the time to offer my attention, not to go numb. That's the message I'm telling myself. Offer attention to what's happening. Offer my attention to the disappointments, the pain, the heartache, the longings, offer my attention. There are 1 billion ways to go numb. And you've probably seen it. Alcohol sales are way up. Weed is way up. Netflix is way up. And I don't blame anyone for this. And I go to sleep watching Netflix too. So it's like even though we have 1 million ways to stay numb, that's not the deeper invitation. And that's not what I hear Roosevelt calling us to, saying, all right, this is a time for self-denial. Listen to these words that are so unpopular. Let me just read it to you again. The front is right here at home in our daily lives and in our daily tasks. Here at home, everyone will have the privilege of making whatever self-denial is necessary. What a noble way of talking about it. That sacrifice and self-denial and the denial of luxuries is noble. And I guess I need to hear that right now. So anyway, back to my point and the question of returning back to normal. My intuition says there is no normal, and that we ought not to be longing to go back to normal. In fact, we need an expansion of consciousness, not just a return, not a going back, not let's make America like it was before, but an expansion, a greater awareness of the fragility of life, the fragility of our own systems, our own economic systems and our healthcare systems and our borders, things like that. The fragility of such things calls for a greater expansion of consciousness. Because normal looks like, I made a list of things, very short. Normal, up to this point, has looked like intense global pressure on ecosystems. That's what we've called normal. We've said our normal way of life causes intense pressure on global ecosystems. Normal looks like massive disparities of wealth and inequality. Normal looks like a disposable lifestyle, materialism and rooted in a disposable lifestyle. And normal looks like a food system with no borders. And you make your own list. That was like, barely any effort on my part. But my feeling is, on the one hand, I want life to go back to a sense of safety and togetherness. That I do long for. I don't want this to continue. I don't want increased suffering. I don't want increased death. I don't want increased loss of income for the rich or the poor. I don't want that. No one does. And yet, I think part of what we're being asked on the global scale by this virus is a kind of invitation to let go of the normal and live into the realities of what we're being invited to offer our attention to the ways in which our system is radically changing and being challenged. Something like that. Here, let's turn to some poems here. Here's a bit of T.S. Eliot from the Four Quartets. Just the opening lines of East Coker here. It's difficult to read T.S. Eliot, period. It's difficult to read T.S. Eliot on a Facebook Live post or Instagram or whatever. So you can return to it on your own. So this is T.S. Eliot writing during a time of intense global collapse and renewal. In my beginning is my end. In my beginning is my end. In succession. Houses rise and fall. Houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory or a bypass. Old stone to new buildings, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. There is a time for building and a time for living and for generation. and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots. T.S. Eliot is saying something like, there is a time for everything. And I think he's saying something like, turn your attention to what the time is asking for right now, as things are destroyed and built up and renewed, and the factory is turned into a field, and houses rise and fall, and the wind beats against the house. What kind of time is it? I think that's the question. What kind of time is it? What is time asking of us right now, this time, this place, and this present moment? And I think I heard this morning as I was thinking about this T.S. Eliot poem, one of the greatest books in the entire Bible, in the entire Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet as it's called in Hebrew. Listen to some of the language here. Utter futility, says Kohelet. Utter futility, all is futile. You know, you think Nietzsche ushered in existential musings. You know, this is 3,000 years old. Well, 2,500 years old. Utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man or a woman in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? What real value is there for a man or a woman in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? These are the kinds of questions that certain times ask of us, like what really matters? What gains really matter under the sun? Of course, the most famous passage in Kohelet you've heard, and it's worth hearing. There is a season for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. I mean, people think the Bible is irrelevant. They just haven't read it. Yes, there's a time for everything. And I think what I'm hearing in the impulse of these ancient words from T.S. Eliot and from Kohelet is not a kind of numb, like, oh, there's a time for everything and seasons to turn. But no, it's a time for offering our attention to the present, to what is actually happening. Is it a time for ripping or a time for sowing? And maybe a question like this is answered throughout the day, not as a blanket answer. What is the moment calling for? What is the moment calling us toward? What is being asked of us? And part of that, I think, requires a certain level of metaphoric sobriety. Like, no, this is not a time for numbing, I don't think. It's a time for attention to ourselves, to the inner landscape, to our friends and neighbors, to our caregivers and healthcare workers and health systems, and our economy and our businesses, and how much of our own society lives paycheck to paycheck. What does it mean to offer our attention to such a thing? To let it work on us. To let the kairos moment, not chronos, chronological, fullness of time come into the present moment to awaken us to something. That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm wondering about. And that's why I find something like, let's just get back to normal, not very palatable. I don't think that's what the moment is asking of us. I want to end, I think, today with one more poem. And I think poets make a deal with the devil, so to speak. And here's the deal. I'm going to tell the truth. That's the poetic deal with the devil. Or maybe we could say all good art makes such a deal. And we need poems, I think. We need art. We need depth. We need other voices than the tyranny of the urgent and its numbers and its demands and its tweets. You know, Twitter will be nothing more than, and I'm not against it, but it's nothing more than the tyranny of the urgent. And by urgent, I mean this, and it's gone the next. I think our great poets invite us into the depth dimension of the present moment. By hearing poetry and hearing wisdom and letting it work and stir on us. That's my little riff on why we need poems. So here's a poem by William Stafford. And it's called A Valley Like This. William Stafford, A Valley Like This. Sometimes you look at an empty valley like this, and suddenly the air is filled with snow. That is the way the whole world happened. There was nothing, and then maybe sometime you will look out, and even the mountains are gone, and the world become nothing again. What can a person do to help bring back the world? What can a person do to help bring back the world? We have to watch it and then look at each other. We have to watch it and then look at each other. Together, we hold it close and carefully save it, like a bubble that can disappear if we don't watch out. We have to watch it and then look at each other. Together, hold it close and carefully save it like a bubble that can disappear if we don't watch it. Please think about this as you go on. Breathe on the world. Breathe on the world. Hold out your hands to it. When mornings and evenings roll along, watch how they open and close, how they invite you to the long party that is your life. Please think about this as you go on. Breathe on the world. Hold out your hands to it, to this moment. When mornings and evenings roll along, watch how they open and close, how they invite you to the long party that is your life. Thank you for joining me this morning. And I have my own podcast inspired by T.S. Eliot called Hints and Guesses, which is a line from T.S. Eliot. And when I'm teaching, like right this moment, I hear those words in the back of my head, hints and guesses. And because my hope is that you hear a hint and a guess. I never know what my own words might stir, and I certainly never know what Kohelet and T.S. Eliot and William Stafford and Roosevelt might stir. So I hope you heard a hint or a guess this morning and are able to say yes. And I wish you safety this week. I wish you courage to face the present moment in all of its ambiguity, and to let it work on, and to be willing self-denial and self-sacrifice so that we can dream a better world, even now, where in the world that seems to be unraveling. So Blessings. Grace. If you want to help out C3, you can always do so online by giving us a donation. Anything will help us put this and keep our community going, and help out our musicians and so forth. So hang tight, and we'll peace.